Welcome to Everything Casual, bringing you original football casual videos from the golden era of the 80s and 90s, right up to current day. Football away day stories and historic clashes between football firms. Subscribe so you don't miss out. We upload videos every week.
Pat Dolan, known to many simply as Fat Pat, was a name that carried weight across football terraces, city streets and doormen's doors throughout London. Among those who stood alongside him and even those who stood against him, he was known as a formidable figure, a man respected, feared and remembered in equal measure. Today, as we look back on his life, this is not just a story about football violence or rivalries. It is the story of a man who lived through one of the most intense eras of English football culture, a man whose presence became part of the folklore of the Chelsea Headhunters and whose reputation stretched far beyond Stamford Bridge. Pat Dolan has now passed away, but among those who knew the era and those who lived it, his name still carries meaning. This video is a tribute to his memory, built from his own words, stories and recollections. These are accounts drawn from interviews, books and witness memories, stories told by the man himself and by those who crossed paths with him. Some of these moments are chaotic, some shocking and others deeply personal, but together they form a portrait of a man who lived life at full pace in a time when football culture was raw, tribal and often unpredictable. To understand Pat Dolan, you have to begin long before the headlines, before the notoriety and before the reputation that followed him around stadiums and city centres across Britain and Europe. His story begins in West London, in an era when working class communities were tight-knit, tough and fiercely loyal to their neighbourhoods. Pat grew up in Shepherd's Bush, West London, an area known for its strong Irish roots and proud working class identity. Like many families in that part of London at the time, his background was shaped by discipline, loyalty and the importance of standing your ground. The streets around Shepherd's Bush were tough places to grow up, but they also created characters who learned quickly how to look after themselves. He attended Pope John Catholic School and later the London Oratory School, institutions known for their strict standards and strong religious influence. School life, like it was for many young boys growing up in London during the 1960s and 1970s, was often shaped by discipline and routine, but outside the classroom, the streets told a very different story. It was on those streets and in the playgrounds and alleyways where reputations were formed early. Even as a young lad, Pat found himself drawn to football. In West London, football wasn't just entertainment, it was identity. Clubs represented neighbourhoods, families and pride. And for Pat, like thousands of other young boys growing up in the shadow of Stamford Bridge Chelsea Football Club, became part of his life long before he ever stepped inside the stadium. His earliest memories of Chelsea were not glamorous or organised. They were raw, unpredictable and fuelled by curiosity. Like many young lads of the era, he didn't always have the money for a match ticket. That didn't stop him. Instead, he and others would look for ways to sneak into Stamford Bridge, slipping past turnstiles or finding weak spots in the ground's perimeter. Anything to be part of the atmosphere. The terraces of Stamford Bridge during those years were nothing like the modern stadium experience seen today. They were loud, intimidating and fiercely territorial, packed with thousands of supporters standing shoulder to shoulder. The noise was constant chants, shouting, the sound of boots on concrete steps and the electric tension that always seemed to hang in the air. For a young Pat, stepping into that world was unforgettable. It wasn't just about football, it was about belonging. The Terraces offered identity, brotherhood, and a sense of loyalty that extended beyond 90 minutes of play. These were places where reputations were made, alliances formed, and rivalries burned deep. Outside of football, life moved quickly into adulthood. Like many young men growing up in London at the time, Pat entered the working world early. Jobs were physical, demanding, and often unforgiving. Hard work was simply part of daily life, and the discipline learned through labour would later shape his reputation as a dependable and imposing figure. Over time, Pat became involved in security work, first locally and later as a doorman. This was an environment that demanded presence, confidence, and the ability to handle confrontation calmly but firmly. The world of London door work in those years was tough, and respect was earned through actions rather than words. It was here that Pat's physical presence and natural authority began to define how others saw him. Working doors across London exposed him to all kinds of situations, arguments, confrontations, late night tensions, and required the kind of resilience that only came from experience. Those who worked alongside him often spoke about his reliability and his willingness to stand firm when situations turned difficult. But no matter how demanding work became, football remained constant. Chelsea matches became more than just something to watch. They became something to live for. Match days meant movement, anticipation, and the gathering of familiar faces who shared the same colours and the same sense of loyalty. In those early years, the culture around football was beginning to change. Groups of young supporters were starting to organise themselves, forming tight-knit mobs that travelled together, stood together and defended their territory against rivals. Loyalty to club colours went beyond chanting. It became something physical, something territorial, and something that demanded commitment. It was in this environment that Pat Dolan began to establish himself among other Chelsea supporters. At first, he was just another young lad finding his place among older figures who had already built reputations of their own. But over time, through repeated encounters and growing confidence, he became known not just for showing up, but for standing firm when it mattered. Those who remember the era often describe Stamford Bridge as one of the most intimidating grounds in the country during those years. Visiting supporters knew they were stepping into hostile territory, and Chelsea fans were known for defending their home with intensity. It was a time when reputation travelled fast. Word spread from city to city about which mobs were strongest, which individuals were feared, and which grounds were the hardest to visit. For Pat, this period marked the beginning of a journey that would eventually take him far beyond West London, to rival grounds across the country, to tense confrontations on streets and railway platforms, and eventually to clashes across Europe. But at this stage, it was still about learning the culture, learning the faces, and learning the unwritten rules that governed life on the terraces. These were formative years that shaped the man he would become, and years that placed him firmly within a generation of supporters who would later define one of the most notorious eras in English football history. And as his confidence grew, so too did his reputation, first locally, then across London, and eventually across the wider football scene. What began as a young boy sneaking into Stamford Bridge had started to evolve into something much larger, something that would follow him for the rest of his life. As Pat Dolan grew older, football gradually moved from being a weekend thrill into something that shaped his identity. The Terraces weren't just somewhere to watch a match anymore, they were somewhere to belong. By the time he was moving into his late teenage years and early adulthood, the culture around football was shifting rapidly, and the atmosphere inside grounds across London was becoming more organised, more territorial and far more confrontational. Chelsea, during that period, was developing a reputation that travelled far beyond West London. Stamford Bridge had become known as a difficult place to visit, both on and off the pitch. Visiting supporters didn't just worry about the result, they worried about what might happen before the game, during the match, and long after the final whistle. Pat became increasingly drawn into that world. The friendships he formed through football were strong and loyal, built on shared experiences, long journeys, and the understanding that everyone around you was part of the same cause. The sense of belonging was powerful, and for many young men at the time, it became addictive. Fashion played a major part in that identity. The Terrace look began to evolve away from traditional club colours and scarves into something more subtle and deliberate. Designer labels and smart casual clothing became part of the culture, a way to blend in, move freely, and avoid drawing attention until it was too late for rivals to react. Pat embraced that shift in style, like many others of his generation, looking sharp, mattered, presentation mattered. It wasn't about wearing club colours, it was about looking confident, organised and ready. The casual look became a badge of belonging in its own right, and those who wore it understood exactly what it represented. Match days followed a familiar rhythm. The build-up often started hours before kick-off, meeting in pubs, sharing stories, and watching as numbers gradually increased. There was always tension in the air, the knowledge that something could happen at any moment, rivals, supporters moving through the same streets, trains arriving at nearby stations, police trying to anticipate movements. It all added to the atmosphere. For Pat, these early years were about learning how mobs moved, how situations developed, and how quickly things could escalate. Older figures within the Chelsea scene had already built reputations, and younger members paid attention, watching closely and learning through experience. It wasn't long before Pat found himself involved in his first serious confrontations. These weren't isolated scuffles or minor disagreements, they were organised encounters, often involving large numbers of supporters from opposing sides. The energy was intense, and once situations began, there was rarely any turning back. One of the early lessons Pat remembered clearly was how quickly a situation could change. A quiet street could transform into chaos within seconds. A group of rival supporters appearing from nowhere, shouting, charging, and suddenly everyone was moving, reacting, defending territory without hesitation. Those early confrontations hardened individuals quickly. There was no time for hesitation or second guessing. If you stood your ground, you earned respect. If you ran, word travelled just as quickly. As Chelsea's following continued to grow in both numbers and reputation, travelling to away games became a major part of life. The journeys themselves were often as important as the matches, trains packed with supporters, coach convoys moving through motorways, and police presence increasing at major stations. It all added to the tension and expectation. Pat began to experience the full scale of football travel culture. Away days meant stepping into hostile environments, entering rival territories and facing supporters who were just as determined to defend their ground as Chelsea were to challenge it. At times, the confrontations were sudden and chaotic. Rival supporters would gather in city centres waiting for visiting mobs to arrive. Police would attempt to separate groups, but their efforts often created delays, bottlenecks and frustration, conditions that sometimes made confrontations even more likely. There were moments when the anticipation alone was enough to raise the tension to breaking point. hours of waiting, moving through unfamiliar streets, hearing rumours about rival numbers. It all created an atmosphere where violence felt inevitable. Through repeated exposure to these situations, Pat began to build his reputation, not through words, but through presence. Being there when things happened mattered. Standing firm mattered. Those who were regularly seen at the centre of movement gradually became known, not just among their own supporters, but among rivals as well. Football violence during this era wasn't random chaos. It followed patterns, unwritten rules that those involved came to understand. Territory mattered, timing mattered, numbers mattered, and once reputations were established, they travelled quickly across the country. Pat became increasingly recognised as someone who could be relied upon to show up. Reliability in that world carried enormous weight. Being present at major fixtures, standing alongside familiar faces and refusing to back down, those were the qualities that defined respect among supporters. As his involvement deepened, the scale of incidents began to grow. What started as smaller encounters gradually evolved into larger clashes involving dozens, sometimes hundreds of supporters from opposing sides. The noise, the movement, the sudden bursts of action, it all became part of the rhythm of football life. The police presence around football also began to intensify. Authorities were becoming increasingly aware of the scale of the problem, and strategies were introduced to control movement and reduce confrontations. Supporters were escorted, diverted, and often delayed, sometimes held in stations or redirected through unfamiliar routes. But those measures rarely stopped determined groups from finding each other. If anything, they often created longer build-ups, increasing frustration and anticipation until situations eventually exploded into action. Pat's early experiences during this period shaped how he approached everything that followed. He learned how to read situations, how to move within a group, and how to recognise when tension was about to break. Those lessons would become critical in the years ahead, years that would see him involved in some of the most intense football confrontations of the era. Because by now, football was no longer just part of Pat Dolan's life. It had become central to it. And the next stage of his story would see that involvement escalate dramatically from organised clashes across England to larger confrontations that would eventually take him far beyond domestic football. By the time Pat Dolan was fully established within the Chelsea scene, football violence in England had moved into a new phase. It was no longer just spontaneous trouble after matches. It had become organised, anticipated, and in many cases inevitable. Rivalries were deeply rooted, and fixtures between certain clubs carried tension long before kick-off. Chelsea during this period were rapidly building a reputation as one of the most formidable mobs in the country. Stamford Bridge was widely regarded as hostile territory, and travelling Chelsea supporters were known for their willingness to confront rivals in their own city. Pat found himself at the centre of this evolving culture, travelling regularly and becoming part of the core movement that defined Chelsea's presence. One of the early incidents that stayed with him involved a confrontation that highlighted just how dangerous these encounters could become. It was during an away fixture when tensions had been building throughout the day. Rival supporters had gathered in numbers, and the atmosphere was already strained before the groups came face to face. When the confrontation finally erupted, it happened quickly and with little warning. Movement turned into chaos almost instantly. Objects were picked up and used as weapons, and among the confusion, Pat witnessed the level of violence escalate beyond what many would consider a typical Terrace clash. During that particular encounter, one of the most shocking moments involved the use of a cricket bat. It was a reminder that some individuals arrived prepared for serious confrontation, and that the line between football rivalry and outright violence had already begun to blur. Incidents like this left lasting impressions on those present, reinforcing the reality that these were not harmless confrontations. They were dangerous, unpredictable, and capable of causing lasting injury. As Chelsea travelled more frequently, rivalries with London clubs became particularly intense. Matches against West Ham, Spurs and Arsenal were rarely straightforward. These were not just football fixtures, they were territorial battles between neighbourhood identities, histories and reputations. Encounters involving West Ham supporters in particular carried a long-standing sense of hostility. Movement around stations, pubs and surrounding streets was often closely watched, with both sides anticipating opportunities to challenge one another. Police presence during these fixtures became increasingly heavy, but even large deployments struggled to keep rival groups completely separated. Pat recalled occasions where the tension surrounding West Ham fixtures was almost as memorable as the clashes themselves. The anticipation, the rumours about numbers, the sudden appearance of rival supporters, it all created an atmosphere where violence felt unavoidable, and Tottenham fixtures carried their own level of intensity. North London visits were never comfortable journeys, and the hostility between supporters often began the moment travelling fans entered rival territory. Police escorts became routine, but even under supervision, there were always moments where rival groups managed to confront one another. Arsenal fixtures also carried significant tension, particularly when large numbers gathered around the famous Clock End at Highbury. That area became symbolic territory, a place associated with confrontation and crowd movement. Incidents around the Clock End were remembered not just for their scale, but for the sheer determination shown by both sides to control space and maintain presence. Brighton was another location where events escalated beyond normal expectations. One particular match became memorable due to the scale of movement that followed the final whistle. Supporters surged forward, and what began as chanting quickly transformed into pitch invasion. Scenes of supporters spilling onto the field were not uncommon during that era, but this particular moment stood out due to the sheer number involved and the speed at which the situation unfolded. Moments like these defined the era. They weren't isolated occurrences, they were part of a pattern that repeated itself across grounds throughout the country. Every fixture carried the possibility of confrontation, and every journey added another layer to personal reputation. For Pat, these incidents marked the transition from being a participant to being recognised. Familiar faces began to notice him. Word spread about who could be relied upon when things turned serious. Reputation within that world wasn't built overnight. It came from repeated presence, repeated movement, and repeated willingness to stand alongside others. Injuries became part of the reality. Broken noses, cuts, bruises, these were common outcomes of clashes that often lasted only minutes, but felt far longer in the moment. The physical cost of involvement became something that many accepted without hesitation. Despite the risks, the culture continued to grow. Larger numbers gathered for major fixtures, and the scale of confrontations increased accordingly. What once involved dozens now involved hundreds. Police forces across the country began adapting tactics in response, attempting to control movement and anticipate flashpoints before they occurred. But even as tactics changed, determined groups continued to find ways to confront one another. Movement became more strategic, routes were altered deliberately, meeting points were chosen carefully. The element of surprise became an important advantage. For Pat, These years were formative not just physically but mentally. He learned how to anticipate movement, how to recognise warning signs, and how to remain composed in chaotic environments. Those skills would later define his reputation as someone who could remain steady even when situations escalated rapidly. And as his experience grew, so too did his confidence. By now, Pat Dolan was no longer just another face in the crowd. He was becoming known among Chelsea supporters, among rivals, and among those who followed the growing reputation of football mobs across England. But while domestic clashes had already defined much of his early involvement, the next stage of his journey would push things even further, because football violence was no longer confined to England. Travel beyond the country to European fixtures and international tournaments would introduce new environments, new dangers, and far larger confrontations than anything experienced before. And it was during those trips abroad that some of the most dramatic and widely remembered incidents of Pat Dolan's life would take place. By the time football travel began taking Pat Dolan beyond England's borders, the culture surrounding the national team had already developed into something powerful and unpredictable. England away matches during that era attracted thousands of supporters, many of whom travelled not just for football but for the confrontation that often followed it. Travelling abroad brought new challenges. The language was unfamiliar, the surroundings unpredictable, and policing methods often very different from those used in England. But if anything, these differences only added to the excitement and tension. For many supporters, travelling overseas felt like entering hostile territory where anything could happen. Pat remembered how the build-up to European trips always carried a different kind of energy. Journeys began long before the actual match, sometimes involving long coach rides, ferry crossings, or packed trains filled with supporters eager to make their presence known. The sense of anticipation was constant, building with every mile travelled. Germany became one of the first places where Pat experienced the full scale of European football confrontation. The organisation of German police forces was immediately noticeable. Their methods were more disciplined, more calculated, and far less tolerant of disorder than what many English supporters had experienced at home. But despite the heavy policing, tension still found ways to erupt. One particular encounter remained vivid in Pat's memory. It involved movement through German streets where rival supporters had gathered in numbers, watching closely as English fans entered the area. The atmosphere was tense, with police attempting to hold lines and prevent direct contact. Yet, as had happened so many times before, control eventually broke down. Rival supporters surged forward, and within moments, the situation descended into chaos. Movement became frantic, with supporters charging, shouting, and attempting to gain the upper hand in unfamiliar surroundings. Encounters like these introduced a new level of risk. Unlike domestic clashes, there was often less familiarity with escape routes or safe areas. Streets were unfamiliar, transport systems confusing, and police responses often faster and more forceful than those seen in England. Another memorable experience came during trips involving clubs such as Schalke and Borussia Dortmund. These were environments known for passionate supporters and fierce local pride. Entering those areas as visiting supporters carried obvious risk, particularly when rival groups were already prepared for confrontation. Pat described situations where English supporters moved through tightly controlled routes, closely monitored by police units equipped to handle large-scale disturbances. But despite the presence of authority, there were still moments when rival supporters managed to gather in numbers, waiting for opportunities to challenge visiting groups. Clashes during these trips were often fast and intense. There was little time to prepare once movement began. Supporters relied heavily on numbers and quick reactions, and once momentum shifted in one direction, it was difficult to reverse. Poland presented another set of challenges. Travelling through Eastern Europe introduced environments that felt more unpredictable than those previously experienced. Infrastructure was different, policing tactics varied, and the behaviour of local supporters was often aggressive from the outset. Pat recalled occasions where tension built steadily throughout the day, with rumours spreading about rival numbers gathering in nearby areas. The sense of anticipation was overwhelming, and once confrontations began, they often escalated quickly. But perhaps some of the most dramatic experiences came during trips to Holland. Travelling through the Netherlands brought supporters into contact with some of the most organised rival groups in Europe. Dutch supporters had built reputations of their own, known for discipline, planning and willingness to confront visiting mobs directly. One journey in particular stood out due to the way police attempted to control movement from the moment English supporters arrived. Instead of allowing free travel through city centres, authorities used containment tactics, delaying trains, redirecting routes and attempting to separate groups before they could meet. At one stage, supporters found themselves held back for extended periods, prevented from moving freely while police assessed the situation ahead. Frustration began to build. The longer groups were contained, the more tension grew among those waiting. Eventually movement resumed, but by then the atmosphere had already reached breaking point. As groups travelled further along their routes, reports began circulating that rival supporters were gathering nearby. Word spread quickly, heightening anticipation among those present. Supporters watched carefully, scanning surroundings for any sign of approaching opposition. And then, as had happened so many times before, confrontation became unavoidable. One of the most dramatic moments from these Holland trips involved movement along motorway routes, environments rarely associated with football confrontation. Yet during this particular journey, rival supporters managed to intercept travelling groups, creating chaos in a location completely outside traditional football settings. Vehicles slowed, doors opened, and supporters moved quickly onto the road. What followed was a sudden and intense confrontation, played out in full view of stunned drivers and shocked onlookers. The unpredictability of such encounters made them especially dangerous. Unlike stadium surroundings, there were no barriers, no defined boundaries, only open road and uncontrolled movement. Moments like this demonstrated how football confrontation had evolved far beyond the traditional confines of terraces. Battles were no longer limited to stadiums or city streets. They could happen anywhere: motorways, service stations or railway platforms, wherever rival groups crossed paths. Police responses to these incidents became increasingly strategic. Authorities introduced containment methods designed to prevent movement altogether, holding groups in controlled areas and delaying travel wherever possible. But these methods often created new flashpoints as frustration among supporters built during long periods of waiting. Pat remembered how the uncertainty surrounding these journeys added to the intensity. There was always the question of what lay ahead: rival groups waiting, police barricades forming, or unexpected confrontations emerging without warning. Through repeated exposure to these situations, Pat developed a deep understanding of how football violence operated across borders. He learned how different police forces responded, how rival supporters behaved, and how quickly situations could escalate in unfamiliar surroundings. These European experiences pushed individuals to their limits. The stakes felt higher, the risk greater, and the consequences more unpredictable than anything encountered in England. But they also reinforced reputation. Supporters who travelled regularly, who stood firm in unfamiliar environments, and who returned repeatedly from difficult trips gained recognition across the wider football scene. Their names became known not just locally but internationally. By now, Pat Dolan had become one of those names. His presence at major fixtures, both domestic and international, placed him among a generation of supporters who defined one of the most turbulent periods in football history. Yet despite the scale of these confrontations, the physical clashes were only part of the story. Because reputation wasn't built solely on confrontation, it was also shaped by loyalty, reliability, and the respect earned among both friends and rivals. And as Pat's involvement deepened, the focus gradually shifted from simply taking part to becoming recognised as a figure others looked toward when situations became uncertain. By the time Pat Dolan had travelled across England and into Europe on multiple occasions, his involvement in football culture had moved beyond simply turning up. He had become a recognised presence, someone known among familiar faces and increasingly known by reputation among rivals as well. In that world, reputation wasn't built through talk. It was built through attendance, reliability, and presence. Those who showed up consistently, who stood firm when situations turned difficult, and who returned week after week, earned a kind of respect that couldn't be faked. Pat became known as someone who could be relied upon, a steady presence among groups that depended heavily on trust and loyalty. Mob size played a major role in shaping how supporters viewed one another. Numbers mattered not just for physical advantage, but for psychological dominance. The sight of large groups moving through streets or arriving at stations often determined how confrontations unfolded before they had even begun. Pat spoke frequently about the importance of numbers and how different clubs developed reputations based on their ability to mobilise large groups of supporters. Some firms were known for sheer size, while others became respected for organisation and determination even when outnumbered. There was always discussion among supporters about which firms were strongest, which travelled best, and which grounds were hardest to visit. These conversations became part of football folklore passed from one generation to the next. Certain clubs developed particularly strong reputations during this era. Teams with large travelling followings were often spoken about with caution, and encounters with these groups carried added tension. Supporters paid close attention to rumours about numbers, how many rivals were expected, where they might gather, and how prepared they appeared to be. Pat remembered how word of mouth shaped expectations long before groups came face to face. News travelled quickly through pubs, trains, and meeting points. Reports about rival numbers or previous encounters influenced how supporters approached each fixture. Tactical awareness became increasingly important as policing methods grew more sophisticated. Authorities began using escorts, containment zones, and controlled routes to separate rival groups. Supporters responded by adapting their own movements, choosing alternative paths, arranging meeting points, and attempting to outmaneuver police where possible. Movement through cities became something of a strategy. Routes were planned carefully, often changing at short notice depending on information received along the way. Those who understood how to move effectively gained an advantage, while mistakes could leave groups exposed. Pat developed a reputation not just for being physically present, but for understanding how situations unfolded. Experience taught him how to read tension, how to recognise when confrontation was likely, and when restraint might be necessary. Among supporters, loyalty remained one of the most valued traits. Standing alongside the same faces week after week created bonds that extended far beyond football. These relationships were built on shared experiences, long journeys, chaotic confrontations, and the knowledge that everyone involved depended on one another. Trust was essential. In unpredictable environments, knowing who stood beside you mattered more than anything else. Pat's reliability strengthened his standing among those around him. He became someone others recognised, someone whose presence added confidence to the group. Rival supporters also paid attention. Reputation travelled both ways. Individuals who appeared repeatedly at major fixtures gradually became known by face and by name. Recognition among rivals carried its own form of respect and acknowledgement that certain figures were always present when major encounters took place. But with growing reputation came increased risk. Police attention became more focused on individuals known to be involved in repeated incidents. Surveillance increased and tactics designed to identify key figures became more common. Authorities understood that controlling movement often meant identifying those who influenced group behaviour. Pat experienced firsthand how policing strategies evolved during these years. Escorts became stricter, travel restrictions more common, and surveillance more visible. Supporters were often watched closely, particularly during high-risk fixtures. Despite the increased scrutiny, involvement continued. The culture surrounding football had developed its own momentum, fueled by loyalty, rivalry, and reputation. For many involved, stepping away became increasingly difficult as friendships deepened and reputation solidified. But beneath the surface, the reality of the lifestyle began to show its cost. Injuries accumulated over time, cuts, bruises, broken bones, reminders of how dangerous confrontations could become. These weren't rare outcomes, they were accepted risks within a culture where physical encounters were often expected. There were also consequences beyond the physical. Relationships outside football sometimes suffered. Time spent travelling, preparing for matches, and recovering from incidents took its toll on personal lives. Pat began to reflect on these costs more as time went on. The excitement of match days remained powerful, but the long-term effects of involvement became harder to ignore. Football had given him identity, loyalty, and recognition, but it had also demanded sacrifice. Despite everything, the sense of belonging remained strong. Those who lived through that era often describe it as addictive, not simply because of the confrontation, but because of the camaraderie that surrounded it. The shared experiences created bonds that were difficult to replace elsewhere. For Pat, football culture had become inseparable from daily life. It shaped his friendships, influenced his routine, and defined much of his identity. Yet even as his reputation continued to grow, another side of his life was unfolding, one that carried consequences far beyond the terraces. Because behind the stories of confrontation and reputation lay a more personal reality, one that would ultimately reveal the emotional cost of the lifestyle he had lived. And it was that personal cost that would become one of the most significant turning points in his life. Beyond the terraces, beyond the confrontations and reputation, there was a life that continued quietly, a life often strained and fractured by the choices Pat had made. Football had given him identity, loyalty, and recognition, but it had also demanded sacrifices that could never be undone. He remembered missing birthdays, family gatherings, and simple moments at home, all because a fixture, a rumour, or a planned journey called him away. These weren't occasional lapses, they were the rhythm of his life for years. Friends who weren't involved in the culture often couldn't understand why he placed loyalty to a firm above everyday responsibilities. There were relationships that didn't survive. Partners, friends, even distant relatives began to drift away. Pat's involvement required focus, energy and time, and that came at a cost. The excitement and adrenaline of match days couldn't replace the loss of everyday presence in the lives of those he cared for. He thought often about the next generation, the children who would grow up seeing only a fraction of the father he could have been. Moments lost could never be recovered. Football may have offered camaraderie and thrills, but it couldn't give back the days, the conversations, or the shared experiences missed with family. Regret became a quiet companion. It wasn't the violence itself that haunted him most, it was the subtle erosion of connection with those he loved. The friendships formed on the terraces were intense and immediate, but they existed in a world separate from home, and over time, the balance tilted. In these reflections, Pat often confronted the duality of his life. He had been brave, loyal, and respected among his peers. Yet bravery on the terraces didn't translate to life at home. Loyalty to the firm didn't heal fractures with loved ones. Reputation earned in the streets couldn't shield him from personal loss. These moments of reflection were often accompanied by physical reminders, scars, bruises, and aches that told the story of years spent in confrontations. Each mark was proof of survival, of loyalty, and of a world that demanded constant readiness. But they were also symbols of cost, of wear, and of the life lived in extremes. Pat spoke quietly about these things later in life, recognizing that the excitement, the adrenaline, and the camaraderie were intoxicating but transient. The real lasting impact was in the spaces between, in the quiet moments when the choices made became clear. And yet, despite regret, he never dismissed the friendships formed, the sense of belonging, or the lessons learned. Those experiences shaped him, for better and for worse. They taught resilience, observation, and the reality of consequence, lessons that couldn't be found anywhere else. For those who witnessed him in action, Pat Dolan remained a figure of respect and reputation. For those who knew him privately, he was a man of reflection and understanding, aware of both the highs and the costs of a life spent in the world of football hooliganism. In the end, the story of Pat Dolan isn't just one of fights, firms, and reputation. It's a story of humanity, choices, and consequences. A reminder that every action comes with a cost, and that loyalty, courage, and identity often exist alongside loss, regret, and reflection. Pat Dolan's story is one of loyalty, courage, and camaraderie. A life lived fully within the world he knew, a world that shaped him and left its mark. His reputation, his presence, and the memories he left behind continue to echo through the terraces, the pubs, and the stories shared by those who knew him. Though he passed away some years ago, the legacy of Pat Dolan remains a testament to the highs, the risks, and the bonds that defined a generation. We honour his life, his choices, and the complex human story behind the legend. His story is a reminder that behind every name, every firm, and every battle, there was a person with friends, family, regrets, and moments of pride. If you've enjoyed this journey into the world of football culture, the stories of those who lived it, and the life of Pat Dolan, please consider subscribing to the channel. Every like, every comment, and every share helps us continue to bring these stories to life. Thank you for watching. And remember, the terraces, the stories, and the legends live on in the memories we keep.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you subscribe, you will be notified when we release a new video. It could be your firm we make a video about next, so don't miss out and hit the subscribe button. You can find me on Facebook or email me if you have a good story to tell. See you next time.